I put it out there on social media yesterday as I was doing prep for today's show. And I'm like, explain like I'm 5. What the hell's going on in Boone and Greenville this year? Now, what's going on at App State and what's going on with the Pirates, I think are separate issues. And what the fan bases are ultimately upset about are specific to where they are in their program's life cycle. Okay. So Kevin, a former colleague of ours, referring to Sean Clark at App State. He's just not capable of being the head guy, which most of us have known. Attention to detail, sloppiness, just little things that trickle down from a head coach. It's been trending this way for 3 years, but now coming to a full boil. Strong bet there's a new head coach next fall. From Lake, regarding Boone, feels like this is a continuation of last year and Clark's reign as a whole. You can only come up heads on coin flip games so many times, and the Sun Belt has only gotten better.
I was going to say, I'll tell you what I think is the biggest problem for App State. They're 4-7 in league play in the last 2 years. The league has gotten a lot more difficult. I also think you can explain App in this way. They went from Scott Satterfield to Eli Drakewitz, which was a little bit of a easier transition because it was all of Sat's players.
Yeah.
So basically, you had Drink there for 1 year. Who did he really recruit?
Right.
In 1 year.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to blame him for where they are now, but like there's a when you go from Satterfield, like this lifer, to Drink, who was an interloper, then to back to a lifer.
You got to rebuild.
And guess what year it is? It's year 4. Like these are the guys who should be from that class, from those strongest years. Like Drink went 13-1. Like these guys should be flying right now with that type of class. But that also doesn't account for there was a pandemic in the interim.
Yeah.
So I have less questions about App and where they are now. I can more easily explain why they are where they are than I can for ECU.
Quickly about App. In their last 12 losses, 10 of them have been decided by 1 score.
Yeah,
all right.
I mean,
all 4 losses this year have come down essentially to the final play. The Old Dominion game, which they lost 28-21, they fumbled an exchange on 2nd and 1. If they just converted the first down, they could probably run out the clock the rest of the way. Instead, they have to give the ball back, and I believe there was a 4th and 10 that they gave up against Old Dominion, and there's your ball game. You also have, look, are there some mistakes? Like I just mentioned that exchange. Joey Aguilar, who was not the quarterback they thought they were going to have, but actually looks like
I like him.
He's pretty decent, but there's a little feast or famine with him as well, based on what I've been able to watch.
Quarterback.
And youth, to your point about the recruiting, that cycle might be coming home to roost, and it's up to Sean Clark to get App to where they need to be, and that might be next year or the year after.
Yeah.
I get the frustration, though, because I don't think App State's played a normal game in like 2 or 3 years. It's been the most bizarre thing. Now, to ECU, and again, I put this out on social media, and people were doing an awesome job just trying to break this down for me. And like Jeff made a really good point. This is the new world order of Group of 5 football. Winning year in and year out is over unless you have enough NIL money to get, and more importantly, keep talent on your roster.
There you go.
And that's what I was realizing about ECU. Dude, they had like 28 transfers out of the program last year. And not because Mike Houston's doing a bad job. It's just that, hey, man, NIL is going to change the game. And if somebody can throw more money at you at a Power 5 school, that's where you're going to end up going, right?
ECU's offense is really bad. Really, really bad.
We're talking like Scotty Montgomery, John. I texted our friend Denny O'Brien.
Well, ECU's offense right now makes States look like the '89 Niners. Like they're just bad.
I had texted Denny O'Brien like, hey man, what the hell's going on? Because Denny's been around the program for a long time. He's like, man, the offense sucks. It's the John Thompson levels.
Yeah, the offensive line lost a starter to Auburn and one to Oregon. Do you think like they volunteered to go there? No, that's NIL money.
No.
Also, they're so they go 8-5, 7-5 in Houston's 3rd and 4th years. And I actually think Mike Houston's a really good coach. Their schedule was very difficult at the start of this season. But that does not excuse losing to Charlotte. ECU should never lose at home to Charlotte.
Agree.
And also that they can't score any points. But everything, and they also lost Keaton Mitchell and Holt Nailers. Those 2 guys were dudes. Mitchell in particular, I don't think got enough attention while he was putting up the numbers that he did. And then finally, everything I've learned, I learned from Phil Steele.
Yeah.
Do you remember the old turnover margin that he would go through and say, if a team was really good at turnover margin in year 1, I promise you in year 2, that's not something that's sustainable.
Yeah.
Just as we've seen with Bill Barnwell with his thing with NFL teams and how their records in close games will always find its level. ECU was plus 13 last year. Joe, it's really hard to be plus 13 over the course of a college football season. They are actually plus 1 this year, but that's still a significant difference for a team that cannot get anything going on the offensive side of the football.
There's something deeper going on at ECU, and I do think there's a way to tie it between App State and the Pirates. It's the journey up is a lot more fun and easier to accomplish,
of course,
than sustaining and then getting to that last mile to truly get you over the top. So App State goes from an FCS level program. There's the hype around building that program to join the FBS level, getting to better conferences, sustaining that culture. It again, the journey to
with
that,
one coach, by the way, Satterfield.
Yes.
Yeah.
The journey there is easier to do. But then, not that you bump up the things, but to get to that next level, which App State might find trouble doing over the next 5 years in group of 5 play, is much more difficult to sustain or get over the hump. ECU's problem, I think, is twofold. Sustaining is very difficult to do at that level. And ECU is the poster child for the collateral of conference realignment. Straight up. ECU has always been the team that people go, well, what about ECU? How come they can't latch on? Well, the problem is North Carolina is flooded with FBS programs. ECU's in that mix. And they're kind of an afterthought when it comes to the ACC because there's already 4 schools in North Carolina from the state. So they're not going to add another one. The Big 12 might have been.
My thoughts on that.
Yeah, no. And the Big 12 might have had an inkling of adding ECU, but they've never really been in good position to jump on because they're not really viewed as a brand anymore either. When I moved here in 1995, not knowing anything about the area, other than I know that Duke and Carolina play basketball, NC State also basketball school, Jimmy V, XYZ. You know who the football program was when I moved here in 1995? The one that I associated with having football culture?
ECU, because you were down in Miami and they played every year.
Yep.
Yeah.
I knew who ECU was because they played Miami tough.
And they always played them tough.
And of course, you do have the 1995, was it 95 or 96 post-hurricane at Carter Finley Stadium, XYZ, right? So I've always associated them as the football school in North Carolina. They had a culture. But what is ECU's culture now? ECU, it's sad. I'm not bringing this up as like a knock. I'm simply saying, like, because of the constant churn of conference realignment, a fan base and a culture continues to get beat down.
Yeah.
And over time, whether it's through conference realignment, poor hiring decisions, all number of factors, that fan base, man, not that they're going to check out, but they're weary. They're weary. And right now, attendance at games in Greenville is not what you would associate as ECU fandom. And I don't blame them, by the way. So ECU's just in a weird spot, man. ECU's just in a really weird spot. And I don't know how you get out of it unless you're able to join a Power 5 conference. And that's obviously not happening for ECU. You know, they're essentially back in Conference USA.
I was going to say, it's not even so much as a Power 5 conference as one that's a regional one with some interesting opponents.
Yeah.
And my oldest son, James, is a freshman there. And I told him, like, looking forward to this football season. Then the schedule came out and I'm like,
who are they playing?
They played Marshall in week 2. It was the same day as the State Notre Dame game. I'm like, I'm not coming up for that. And then Parents Weekend was Gardner Webb. Cool. We went up there. It poured rain.
Right.
It was their one game this year. But then you look at the rest of their schedule and you're like, give me some recognizable opponents.
I don't have it.
And I know Charlotte, I would love to see them be in a league with Charlotte and App State, where you're like, oh, okay, cool. You could build ODU. You know, you could build some sort of hate and familiarity with some of these guys. But I wish I could solve ECU's problems for them, because I feel like ECU and Boise State is probably another example where you look at it and you go, what happened to these great kind of programs that were football identity? And to your point, they had those builds, and now all of a sudden you're looking at it going, well, what happened to those? Because, like, what happened to Boise State?
Conference realignment,
right?
Conference realignment. It's as simple as that. Because, like, you talk about the opponents, right? When ECU was coming
Boise
up,
State used to line people up and play them in the early in the season. Same with ECU.
App State's going to run into this problem.
Shouts to Terry Holland, man. He did such a great job of getting State and Virginia Tech and Virginia and Carolina on their schedule.
The Sun Belt is not a conference that looks like it's going to be ripe to pluck off. The American, unfortunately, was a feeder program to other conferences. So the ECU goes from Conference USA to the American. That's part. I don't want to relitigate Ruffin McNeil, because in 2013 they won 10 times. It was like the second time it happened in program history. Yeah. And then 2 years later, he was out of there. And it was ultimately because of recruiting and also the step up in competition in the American Athletic Conference. But the problem with the American Athletic Conference is that their good football programs bounced for the Big 12.
Yeah.
So, yes, you were trying to bump up against Central Florida, Cincinnati, Houston. They're gone. SMU is the next one to leave too, because they're in the American right now. And they're going to be joining the ACC next year.
I would rather, if I was ECU, I'd rather be in the Sun Belt with Old Dominion, Georgia State, Georgia Southern, Coastal Carolina, Marshall, and App State and JMU. That's where I would rather be.
And that's where the culture might be able to come back, and that App State is enjoying right now, because to your point, it's regional. Mm-hmm. They're on your level. And if you take yourself out of the constant chase for the college football playoff and you just focus on, let's win our conference, let's win our like group, then maybe ECU can get back to that. Because right now, when you look at them in the American Athletic Conference, what are we doing here, man? Like, seriously, what are we doing? I want to go see. I can't even name who's in the American anymore.
It's hard. I just said, Charlotte is in their conference, but it's like, when did they get there?
Yeah, so the whole thing's a mess, and it sucks.
It's a bunch of Florida schools and a bunch of Texas schools, and you're like, I just don't care.